You can't satisfy me anymore. I've never satisfied you, have I? She was 25, standing in their bedroom doorway after 7 years of marriage, finally saying the words that had been clawing at her throat for months. Her husband, Park Ji-won, sat on the edge of their bed, 55 years old and looking every day of it in that moment. The most feared mafia boss in Seoul, reduced to a man hearing his wife's truth. The entire underground had whispered it for years. Park Ji-won married too young, took a bride fresh out of university, trapped her in a world of blood and money. Poor girl, they said. She'll never survive. But Myra had survived. She'd survived 7 years of this marriage, 7 years of trying to be the perfect wife, 7 years of pretending the age gap didn't matter, that the circumstances of their union didn't haunt her dreams. And now she was done pretending. Welcome to Afro-Korean Romance TV, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe because this story is about to take you places you didn't expect. Myra Kim had been 18 when they first met, a university freshman studying business, working part-time at her aunt's restaurant in Gangnam to help pay tuition. She was young, ambitious, full of dreams about building her own company someday, about making something of herself beyond her middle-class family's expectations. She'd never planned to catch the attention of a man like Park Ji-won. He'd come into the restaurant on a Thursday night, surrounded by men in expensive suits, all of them moving with the kind of careful precision that screamed danger. Myra had served their table, keeping her eyes down, her hands steady, because even at 18 she knew enough to recognize predators. Ji-won had watched her all evening. She'd felt his attention like heat against her skin, uncomfortable and inescapable. When they left, he'd placed a tip on the table that was more than she made in a month, along with a business card that simply read, Park Ji-won, and a phone number. Her aunt had turned pale when she saw the card. Do not call that number, she'd said urgently. Do not acknowledge you ever saw him. That man is dangerous, Myra. He's one of the most powerful people in Seoul's underworld. Promise me you'll throw that card away. Myra had promised. She'd thrown the card in the trash that night. But 3 days later, Ji-won returned to the restaurant. Alone this time, dressed more casually, looking less like a crime lord and more like a successful businessman. He'd sat at her section again, ordered a simple meal, and when she brought his food, he'd asked her name. Myra had hesitated, then answered honestly because lying seemed more dangerous than truth. He'd smiled, and it had transformed his entire face, making him look younger, almost gentle. Beautiful name for a beautiful woman. How old are you, Myra? I'm 18, she'd said, lifting her chin. And I'm not interested in whatever you're offering. I wasn't offering anything, he'd replied calmly. Just making conversation. But since you brought it up, what makes you think I'm offering something? Because men like you don't make conversation with girls like me without wanting something in return. His smile had widened, impressed. Smart. That's good. Intelligence is rare and valuable. How much longer are you working tonight? Why? Because I'd like to drive you home. Make sure you get there safely. Seoul can be dangerous for young women. Especially when crime lords are following them. Myra had shot back before she could stop herself. Ji-won had laughed outright at that, drawing looks from other diners. You're remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. Have dinner with me tomorrow, not as an employee and customer. As two people getting to know each other. I'm 18, she'd repeated. You're what, 50? I'm 48, he'd corrected. And age is just a number when two people connect. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless. Myra should have said no. Should have run. Should have told her aunt immediately and found a different job. But something in his eyes had caught her, something lonely and almost vulnerable beneath all that power and danger. So she'd agreed. Just dinner, she'd said. Just conversation. Nothing more. One dinner had turned into 2, then 5, then regular meetings over the course of 3 months. Ji-won had been patient, never pushing, always respectful. He'd told her about his life, his business that he carefully described as import, export and investments, though they both knew the truth. He'd asked about her dreams, her studies, her family, and actually listened when she talked. He'd been nothing like she expected. Not cruel or violent in her presence, not demanding or controlling. Just a man who seemed genuinely interested in knowing her. She'd started falling for him somewhere around the second month, which terrified her because she knew how this story usually ended. Young girl, powerful older man, a relationship built on unequal footing that would eventually consume her. But Jiwon had surprised her again by asking her to meet his mother, by introducing her to his inner circle, by treating her like she mattered beyond just being pretty and young. When he proposed on her 19th birthday, Myra had said yes despite every logical part of her brain screaming that this was a mistake. She'd said yes because she'd fallen in love with him, because he'd shown her a world beyond her small apartment and part-time job, because he'd promised to support her education and her dreams while giving her the kind of security her family had never known. They'd married quietly a month later. Her parents had been hesitant but ultimately approving because Jiwon had been generous with them, paying off their debts, buying them a better apartment, promising to take care of their daughter. The wedding had been beautiful, traditional, everything a girl could want. And Myra had believed, truly believed, that she was making the right choice. The first year of marriage had been good. Jiwon had kept his promises about her education, enrolling her in the best business program in Seoul, giving her freedom to study and build friendships. He'd been attentive, affectionate, proud of her accomplishments. The age gap had seemed irrelevant when he looked at her like she was the most important thing in his world. But cracks had started showing in the second year. Small things at first. The way he'd make decisions about their life without consulting her. The way his security detail followed her everywhere, making her feel less like a wife and more like a possession being guarded. The way he'd dismiss her opinions in front of his associates, patting her hand and smiling indulgently like she was a child playing at being an adult. Myra had tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself it was just adjustment, just the reality of being married to a man with his kind of power and responsibilities. But the resentment had grown steadily, feeding on every small dismissal, every decision made without her input, every time he treated her age as a liability rather than just a fact. By the third year, they were arguing regularly. Myra wanted more independence, more say in their life together. Jiwon wanted to protect her, to keep her safe in the bubble he'd created. "You don't understand the world I operate in," he'd say. "I'm keeping you safe. I'm not a child," she'd counter. "I'm your wife. I deserve to be treated like a partner, not a pet." They'd go in circles, never resolving anything, both retreating to their corners until the tension built up again. The physical intimacy had started declining around year 4. Not because Jiwon couldn't, he was still perfectly capable, still attractive in that distinguished older man way. But because Myra had stopped wanting to. Every time he touched her, she felt the weight of their age gap, the power imbalance, the way he still treated her like she needed protecting rather than like an equal. She'd started making excuses. Headaches, exhaustion, stress from work because by then she'd started her own small consulting business with his financial backing. Jiwon had noticed, of course. Had tried to talk about it, to understand what was wrong. But how could she explain that she felt suffocated by his love, trapped by his protection, diminished by his constant need to shield her from everything including her own choices? Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless. By year 5, they were living mostly separate lives under the same roof. Jiwon buried himself in his work, coming home late, leaving early. Myra threw herself into her business, building something that was entirely hers, proving she was more than just Park Jiwon's young wife. They were polite to each other, cordial even. But the passion had died, smothered under the weight of unspoken resentments and fundamental incompatibilities they'd ignored while caught up in the romance of their unlikely pairing. Year 6 brought a crisis that should have brought them closer but instead drove them further apart. One of Jiwon's rivals had targeted Myra, attempting a kidnapping that was thwarted by his security team. She'd been terrified, traumatized, needing comfort and reassurance. Instead, Jiwon had become even more controlling, restricting her movements, increasing security to suffocating levels, making unilateral decisions about where she could go and who she could see. "I'm doing this for your safety," he'd insisted when she protested. "Someone tried to take you, Myra. I won't let that happen again. So you're going to make me a prisoner instead?" She'd yelled. "This isn't protection, Jiwon. This is control. This is you deciding you know what's best for me without asking what I need. What you need is to be alive," he'd shot back. "Everything else is secondary." They'd barely spoken for weeks after that fight. Myra had felt the walls closing in, had realized with crushing clarity that this marriage had been a mistake from the start. She'd been too young, too naive, too dazzled by his attention and power to see that love wasn't enough when the foundation was this unequal. Now, at 25, standing in their bedroom after 7 years of trying to make this work, Myra had finally found the courage to say what she'd been feeling for years. "You can't satisfy me anymore." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and devastating. Jiwon looked up at her, his face carefully blank in that way he had when he was processing something painful. "What does that mean?" "You know what it means," Myra said quietly, stepping into the room. "I haven't been happy for years, Jiwon. I've tried. God knows I've tried. But I can't keep pretending this marriage is working. Is this about the age difference? Because I told you from the beginning that it didn't matter." "It does matter," she said. "Not because you're older, but because you've never stopped treating me like I'm still that 18-year-old girl you met. I'm 25 now. I've built a successful business. I've grown and changed and become my own person. But you still see me as someone who needs protecting, someone who can't make her own decisions." Jiwon stood slowly, and even now, even angry and hurt, he moved with that careful control that had first attracted her. "I protected you because I love you. Because the world I live in is dangerous and you're the most precious thing in it." "I know," Myra said, and there were tears in her voice now. "I know you love me. But your love feels like a cage, Jiwon. It feels like you bought something beautiful and want to keep it locked away where nothing can damage it. I'm not a possession. I'm a person. I never treated you like a possession," he said, and there was hurt in his voice now, raw and real. "I gave you everything. Freedom to study, money to start your business, protection, love, everything I had to give. Everything but partnership," she countered. "Everything but respect for my choices. Everything but trust that I could handle my own life. You made decisions for me, about me, without me. For 7 years, I've been trying to be the wife you needed, but I've lost myself in the process." The silence that followed was heavy with 7 years of unspoken truths, compromises that had slowly poisoned what could have been beautiful, love that had been suffocated by control masquerading as protection. "What do you want?" Jiwon asked finally, his voice carefully controlled. "A divorce." Myra's breath caught. She'd been thinking it for months but hadn't said it out loud until now, hadn't let herself fully acknowledge that this marriage was beyond saving. "I think we need to separate," she said quietly. "Not forever, maybe. But I need space to figure out who I am outside of being your wife. I need to breathe, Jiwon. I'm suffocating here." Jiwon's expression cracked slightly, pain flickering across his features. "I gave you everything. I wasn't enough." "You gave me everything but what I actually needed," Myra said gently. "You gave me things, protection, money, status. But you never gave me true partnership. You never saw me as your equal. And without that, all the other gifts in the world don't matter." Jiwon turned away from her, his shoulders tense. "If I let you go, you'll be vulnerable. My enemies will see it as weakness. They'll come after you." "Then deal with your enemies," Myra said. "But stop using them as an excuse to control me. Stop hiding behind protection when what you really want is possession." "That's not fair," he said, his voice rough. "Maybe not, but it's true. Isn't it?" Deep down, you like having control over me. You like knowing exactly where I am, what I'm doing, who I'm with. It makes you feel secure in a world where you control everything except the fact that I'm 30 years younger and might leave. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless. The accusation hit its mark. Myra saw Jiwon's shoulders hunch slightly, saw the truth of her words land. And yes, she admitted. That scared me. From the beginning, I knew the age gap was a problem. I knew eventually you'd wake up and realize you'd married an old man when you could have had someone young, someone who didn't come with enemies and blood on their hands. But I loved you so much I convinced myself it didn't matter. So you controlled me to keep me, Myra said. You built a cage of love and protection and called it marriage. Jiwon turned back to face her, and there were tears in his eyes now, the first time she'd seen him cry in 7 years. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry, Myra. You're right about everything. I did control you. I did treat you like something precious that needed protecting rather than a partner who could stand beside me. I was so afraid of losing you that I held on too tight and lost you anyway. Myra's own tears started falling. I loved you, she whispered. I really did love you, Jiwon. But I can't keep losing myself to be your wife. I can't keep being 25 but feeling like I'm still 18 because you won't let me grow up. Then tell me how to fix this, Jiwon said desperately, crossing to her. Tell me what you need and I'll give it to you. I need you to let me go, Myra said, even as her heart broke saying it. I need space. I need to remember who I am without your shadow covering everything. And you need to figure out if you can love me as an equal or if you only know how to love me as something to protect. Jiwon's hands came up to cup her face, his touch gentle despite the desperation in his eyes. I don't want to lose you. Then prove you can change, she said. Prove you can give me the partnership I need instead of the protection you think I want. But do it from a distance. Let me have my own apartment, my own life, my own breathing room. If we're meant to be together, we'll find our way back. And if we're not, then at least we tried. How long? He asked, his voice rough. How long do you need? I don't know, she admitted. Months, maybe. Maybe longer. As long as it takes for me to find myself again and for you to decide if you can truly see me as your equal. Jiwon was quiet for a long moment, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, catching her tears. Then he nodded slowly. Okay, he said. Okay. You can have your space. I'll make sure you're safe without hovering. I'll give you the distance you need. But Myra, his voice dropped lower, more intense. I'm not giving up on us. I'm giving you space because you need it, because you've earned it. But I love you. I'm going to spend this time learning how to love you better. And when you're ready, I'll be here. The separation had been harder than Myra expected. She'd moved into a small apartment in Itaewon, modest compared to the penthouse she'd shared with Jiwon, but entirely hers. She'd thrown herself into her business, working long hours, building her company into something she could be proud of. She'd reconnected with friends she'd lost touch with during the marriage, had started therapy to work through her feelings about everything that had happened. And she'd waited for the relief to come, for the weight to lift, for the freedom she'd been craving. But instead, she'd felt hollow. Empty in ways she hadn't expected. She'd thought distance from Jiwon would help her breathe, help her remember who she was before him. Instead, she found herself thinking about him constantly, missing him in ways that frustrated her. Missing the way he'd make her coffee exactly how she liked it, the way he'd listen to her talk about her day even when he was exhausted, the way he'd touch the small of her back when they walked together, grounding her. She'd thought she wanted freedom from him, but what she'd really wanted was freedom within the marriage. The space to be herself while still being his partner. Jiwon, true to his word, had given her distance. He'd checked in once a week, brief messages asking if she needed anything, if she was safe, if her business was going well. He never pushed for more, never demanded to see her, never made her feel guilty for choosing to leave. But she'd heard things through mutual acquaintances. Heard that he'd been different since she left, quieter, more withdrawn. That he'd started seeing a therapist himself, working on control issues and fear of abandonment. That he'd asked his mother and closest friends for advice on how to be a better partner, how to unlearn decades of being a man who controlled everything around him. 3 months into their separation, Myra had run into him at a charity event her business was sponsoring. She'd known he'd be there, had steeled herself for seeing him. But nothing could have prepared her for the impact of him in person after so long apart. He'd looked thinner, older, the lines around his eyes deeper. But there'd been something different in his expression when he saw her, something softer, more open. He'd approached carefully, keeping respectful distance. "Myra, you look beautiful. How are you?" "I'm good," she'd said, fighting the urge to touch him. "Business is growing." "I'm good. And you?" "I'm surviving," he'd said with a small, sad smile. "Learning a lot about myself. Most of it uncomfortable. But necessary." They'd talked for a few minutes, carefully polite, both hyper-aware of the space between them and the history behind it. When Jiwon had excused himself, he'd hesitated, then said quietly, "I miss you. Every day, I miss you. But I'm trying to become the man who deserves to have you come back." Myra had watched him walk away and felt her carefully constructed walls start to crumble. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless. 6 months into the separation, Myra had made her decision. She'd gotten coffee with Jiwon's mother, the elegant woman who'd always treated her with kindness despite initially being skeptical of their marriage. Mrs. Park had looked at her across the cafe table with knowing eyes. "You're wondering if you made a mistake leaving him?" Myra had nodded. "I thought I wanted freedom. But I think what I really wanted was for him to trust me, to treat me like an adult, like a partner. And now I don't know if leaving was the right choice or if I gave up too easily." "You were 18 when you married my son," Mrs. Park had said gently. "You're 26 now. In those years, you grew up. You became your own person." But Jiwon had already been grown for decades. He didn't grow with you, he stayed the same, expected you to fit into the life he'd already built. That wasn't fair to you. "But does that mean the marriage was a mistake?" Myra had asked. "Does that mean we can't fix it?" Mrs. Park had smiled. "My son loves you deeply. Stupidly. Painfully. But he loved you the way a man loves a precious treasure, something to keep safe on a shelf. These past 6 months, I've watched him struggle to understand that you needed to be loved as a person with agency, with dreams, with the capacity to make your own choices even if they're risky. He's learning, but learning is painful. The question isn't whether the marriage was a mistake," Mrs. Park had continued. "The question is whether both of you have grown enough now to make it work. Whether he can give you true partnership and whether you can forgive him for the years he didn't." A month later, Myra had called Jiwon. "Can we meet? I want to talk." They'd met at a quiet restaurant, neutral territory, sitting across from each other like the negotiators they'd both become. Jiwon had looked at her with such hope and fear that her heart had ached. "I've been thinking a lot," Myra had started. "About us, about our marriage, about what went wrong and what might go right." "I've been thinking about that too," Jiwon had said quietly. "Every day for 7 months." Myra had taken a deep breath. "I'm not coming back to the same marriage we had. If I come back, if we try this again, everything has to be different. I need real partnership, Jiwon. I need you to consult me on decisions that affect us. I need you to trust me to handle my own security, my own business, my own life. I need you to see me as your equal, not as something fragile that needs protecting." "I know," he'd said. "I understand that now. I've been working with a therapist, learning to recognize my control issues, my fear responses. Learning that love doesn't mean possession and protection doesn't mean control. It's hard, unlearning 55 years of patterns, but I'm trying. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless. What else? Myra had asked. What else are you willing to change? Jiwon had pulled out a document, slid it across the table. This is a post-nuptial agreement. It gives you complete financial independence, ensures your business remains entirely yours, establishes that major decisions about our life together require both our consent. It's legally binding. And this, he'd pulled out another paper, is a letter from me to my organization, making it clear that you are not to be followed, guarded, or monitored without your explicit consent except in cases of verified threats. Your freedom of movement is guaranteed. Myra had stared at the documents, feeling something crack open in her chest. You really have changed. I'm trying to, he'd said. I can't promise I'll be perfect. 55 years of being a certain way doesn't disappear overnight. But I can promise I'll keep trying. That I'll check myself when I slip into old patterns. That I'll value your voice over my need to control. Because losing you taught me what actually matters. The documents matter, Myra had said slowly. But what matters more is why you made them. Why did you, Jiwon? He'd reached across the table, not touching her but close, his eyes holding hers. Because I realized that controlling you was never about keeping you safe. It was about my fear of not being enough for you. You were 18 and brilliant and full of potential, and I was nearly 50 with blood on my hands and enemies everywhere. I was terrified that one day you'd wake up and see me clearly, see that you could have had so much better. So I controlled everything I could to make myself feel secure. But all I did was prove I wasn't enough by refusing to be what you actually needed. And now? Myra had asked, her voice soft. Now I understand that being enough means trusting you, respecting you, partnering with you. It means accepting that you might leave me someday, that our age gap might become too much, that you might outgrow me completely. And choosing to love you anyway, without trying to control the outcome. He'd paused, his voice dropping. I'd rather have one day of true partnership with you than a lifetime of beautiful control. That's the difference. Myra had felt tears building. I don't want to outgrow you, she'd whispered. I never wanted to leave you, Jiwon. I wanted you to make room for me to grow alongside you. I wanted to be your partner, not your protected treasure. I know that now, he'd said. And if you'll give me another chance, I swear I'll spend the rest of my life proving I can be the partner you need. Not perfect, but trying. Not controlling, but supporting. Not protecting you from everything, but standing beside you while you face it. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless. They'd started slowly, dating again like they were new to each other. Dinner once a week, coffee dates, walks through Seoul where Jiwon had to consciously stop himself from hovering, from positioning himself between Myra and perceived threats, from making decisions about where they went without asking her preference first. It had been hard for him, Myra could see. Could see him catching himself mid-gesture, mid-sentence, mid-assumption. Could see the effort it took to undo decades of ingrained patterns. But he kept trying, and that effort meant everything. 3 months of dating had turned into Myra spending weekends at the penthouse, then half the week, then moving back in with the understanding that this was a trial, that they were rebuilding their marriage from the ground up with new foundations. Now, a year after their separation, they were renewing their vows. Not a grand affair like their first wedding, but something intimate and meaningful. Just family and close friends, witnesses to the fact that Park Jiwon and Kim Myra were choosing each other again, older and wiser and more honest about what that choice meant. Myra stood in the simple white dress she'd chosen herself, holding Jiwon's hands while their officiant spoke about second chances and growth and love that evolves. When it was time for vows, Jiwon spoke first, his voice steady but emotional. 7 years ago, I married you believing I knew what you needed. I was wrong. I gave you protection when you needed partnership. I gave you control disguised as care. I held you so tightly I nearly lost you completely. These past months have taught me that loving you means trusting you, respecting your choices even when they scare me, standing beside you instead of in front of you. So I vow to be your partner, not your protector. To ask instead of decide. To listen instead of direct. To love you as the incredible woman you are, not the girl I first met. I vow to keep growing, keep changing, keep earning the privilege of being your husband every single day. Myra had to pause to collect herself before speaking, tears streaming down her face. 7 years ago, I married you full of hope and naivety, believing love would be enough. I was wrong too. Love without respect is suffocation. Partnership without equality is imprisonment. But I also learned that love worth having is love that can survive truth, that can be rebuilt on better foundations, that can grow and change as we grow and change. So I vow to be patient with your growth as you learn new patterns. To speak up when I need something instead of expecting you to read my mind. To forgive the past while building toward a future where we're true partners. I vow to love you not as the powerful man who swept me off my feet, but as the human being who's willing to be vulnerable, to change, to become better. And I vow to keep being myself, fully and completely, trusting that the man I married will love all of me, not just the parts that are easy to control. When they kissed, sealing their renewed vows, it felt different from their first wedding. Less innocent, more knowing. The kiss of two people who'd been broken and rebuilt, who'd learned the hard way that love wasn't enough without partnership, respect, and equality. The reception was small but joyful, filled with people who'd watched them struggle and grow. Mrs. Park had pulled Myra aside at one point, squeezing her hand. "I'm proud of both of you," she'd said. "You for knowing your worth and demanding it. Him for finally learning to see it." That night, back in their penthouse that now felt less like a cage and more like a home, Jiwon had pulled Myra close on the terrace overlooking Seoul. "I want to ask you something," he'd said. "But I want to make sure I'm asking, not deciding." "Ask," she'd encouraged. "I want to start a family with you," he'd said. "I know I'm 55, and that brings complications. I know I might not be around for all of our children's major life events. But if you want children, if you want to build that future together, I want to try." Myra had considered, her head resting against his chest. "I do want children," she'd said finally. "But I want them when I'm ready, not when you decide. I want to build my business more first. I want to be 28, maybe 29. Is that okay?" "That's more than okay," Jiwon had said, kissing her hair. "That's exactly what partnership looks like, you telling me what you need and me supporting it." 2 years later, at 28, Myra had gotten pregnant. It hadn't been planned exactly, but it had been welcomed. She'd built her consulting firm into one of the most respected in Seoul, had proven herself completely independent of her husband's influence even as she'd learned to accept his support when offered. Jiwon had been impossibly gentle through her pregnancy, attentive but not smothering, excited but respectful of her boundaries. When she'd told him firmly that she was still going to work up until her due date and that the bodyguards needed to be discreet, he'd agreed without argument, though she'd caught him white-knuckling through his worry more than once. Their daughter had been born on an autumn evening, arriving with impressive lungs and a full head of black hair. Jiwon had held her with shaking hands, this tiny perfect person who represented everything he'd never thought he'd have at 57 years old. "What should we name her?" Myra had asked, exhausted but radiant. "You choose," Jiwon had said. "This is your decision." She'd smiled at that, at how far they'd come. "Let's choose together," she'd corrected gently. "That's what partners do." They'd named her Hannah, meaning unity, because that's what she represented. The unity they'd had to fight for, break apart, and rebuild stronger. The unity of two people who'd learned the hard way that love required more than passion and protection. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you're going to want to hit that subscribe button because what unfolds next will leave you absolutely speechless. As Jiwon sat beside Myra's hospital bed holding their daughter, he thought about the journey that had brought them here. The mistakes he'd made, the control he'd wielded, the fear that had driven him to cage the woman he loved. He thought about how close he'd come to losing her completely because he'd been too afraid to see her as his equal. And he thought about the man he'd become in the process of nearly losing everything, how learning to let go had actually meant learning to hold on properly. Myra watched her husband cradle their daughter and remembered the 18-year-old girl who'd been swept off her feet by a powerful older man. She thought about the 25-year-old woman who'd had to leave to find herself. And she thought about the 28-year-old she was now, stronger for having fought for herself, wiser for having rebuilt her marriage on her own terms. Outside, Seoul sparkled with its endless lights, the same city where their journey had started a decade ago. Where a young university student had caught the attention of a mafia boss. Where a marriage had been built on unequal foundations and had to be torn down to be rebuilt properly. Where two people had learned that love without partnership was just another form of possession, and possession disguised as protection was still a cage. Jiwon looked at Myra, his eyes soft. "Thank you for what? For giving me a second chance when I didn't deserve one. For teaching me what partnership actually means. For not giving up on us even when I'd given you every reason to." Myra reached for his hand, threading their fingers together. "Thank you for being willing to change, for valuing our marriage enough to do the hard work of becoming better. For proving that even at 57, people can learn new ways of loving." His laugh was quiet, relieved. "Some divorce that would have been. Shortest separation in history." "It wasn't short," she corrected gently. "And it saved us. Sometimes you have to break something completely to rebuild it properly. We broke. We rebuilt. We're better now." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their daughter sleep, knowing their story would sound impossible to outsiders. An 18-year-old girl and a 48-year-old mafia boss, a marriage that had started unequal and had to be completely reconstructed to survive. But impossible things happened every day in Seoul. And sometimes those impossible things taught you that love wasn't about age or power or protection. Love was about respect, partnership, and the willingness to grow, even when growth meant admitting you'd been wrong for years. That night, as the city hummed below and their family slept peacefully, Myra thought about the words she'd said that had started everything. "You can't satisfy me anymore." Those words had been true. Jiwon couldn't satisfy her when he was trying to control her, protect her, keep her locked in the box of who he thought she should be. But this Jiwon, the one who'd learned to be her partner, who'd torn down his own walls to rebuild their relationship properly, who'd chosen growth over control. This Jiwon satisfied her completely. Not because he was perfect, but because he was trying. Not because their marriage was easy, but because they'd both fought to make it real. And as she drifted to sleep beside her husband with their daughter sleeping nearby, Myra knew with absolute certainty that they'd made it. They'd survived the age gap, the power imbalance, the mistakes and miscommunication. They'd survived because they'd been willing to break everything apart and rebuild it better. And that was worth every tear, every fight, every moment of doubt. Because love that survives truth is love worth keeping. And they'd keep each other for the rest of their perfectly imperfect lives. Thanks for watching, besties. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe to Afro-Korean Romance TV for more amazing tales. Drop a comment below telling us what you thought about Myra Kim and Park Jiwon's journey. Should she have stayed? Did he deserve her forgiveness? We want to hear your thoughts. Turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Until next time, besties.